No philosopher in history has been slandered quite as much as Epicurus. He has been painted as an ancient Marquis de Sade, a crude hedonist who only wants to pursue his own pleasure, no matter the cost to those around him. The thing is, none of this is true. And today we're going to learn just how much Epicurean philosophy can help us all. Just as there has been a Stoic revival in the last decade, I'm calling for an Epicurean revival. Epicurus can teach us how to live in our world of endless information and consumption. He can teach us how to be happy in dire circumstances, and he has a vision to reorganize society to prioritize human happiness and meaning above all. Here is the wisdom of hedonism, but not how you've heard it before. So, with all that said, let's get started. 1. A new hedonism. In his classic novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, Oscar Wilde tells the story of a young man who plunges himself fully into hedonism. Gray spends his entire life pursuing short-term pleasure. He abuses alcohol and opium. He parties constantly and pushes away any question of caring about others. He is cruel to those around him, scandalizes his lovers, ruins his supposed friends, and eventually alienates everyone that used to love him. His character degrades to such an extent that he murders former companions, blackmails ex-lovers, and falls into despair. His pursuit of pleasure has made him miserable. And Epicurus was well aware of this sort of situation 2,000 years before Oscar Wilde ever conceived of Dorian Gray. Epicurus talks at length about how happiness is the highest good humans can aim for, but also that the pursuit of that happiness requires wisdom. In his view, many pleasures require moderation so that they won't bring us further pain, and many pleasures are just outright bad because they come with an unacceptable cost. There is some perverse pleasure in wishing that the people around you will fail, and imagining their downfall may bring you some temporary joy if you're a particularly spiteful character. But Epicurus would warn us against pleasures like this. For Epicurus, the value of an activity is measured in the pleasure that it brings someone in the long term. It is not enough to be happy for a day or even a month, because what brings us happiness over a tiny fraction of time may completely destroy us if we carry on with it. If you play roulette and by some stroke of luck win £100,000, that is not a sign that you should continue doing it forever. The odds are stacked against you, and the same applies for some pleasures. One of the key jobs of the philosopher for Epicurus is to identify those pleasures which are wise to pursue, and those that should be best left alone. I certainly notice this in my own life. I have an incredibly addictive and slightly compulsive personality, so I have to constantly be on my guard for when a habit that previously brought me pleasure begins to morph and become something making my life miserable. For instance, last year I got very into exercise, and I ended up in the gym for multiple hours every day, to the point where I was in constant pain. The habit had gone past the point of being helpful and into semi-addictive territory, and this can happen with almost anything. And I noticed that the thinkers that most dwell on the idea of pleasure recognize this. Epicurus thought that pleasure was the highest good, so he thought about it in detail and realized that choosing your pleasures is of the utmost importance. John Stuart Mill's entire ethical system is based around happiness, so he examined in detail which pleasures in his view gave diminishing returns, and which can be pursued with extreme vigor. And this wisdom is needed now more than ever. Many of us are lucky enough to live with excess all around. I can walk 100 feet from my house and pick up food that, in the long term, will make me incredibly ill. I have a device in my pocket which grants me access to 1 million ill-considered opinions on a range of stressful topics. If I wanted to, I could get outrageously drunk tonight, and the next day, and the day after that. With greater access to short-term pleasures comes the greater need to examine these pleasures in turn to see if they bring long-term fulfillment, or if they're just another momentary hit of stimulation to get us through the day. So it's worth taking a leaf out of Epicurus's book and being careful what pleasures we indulge in. And Epicurus has even more to say on the divisive topic of human need. If you want more on philosophy and the art of learning, subscribe to my email list. The link is in the description. 2. The Hedonic Treadmill. In the early 19th century, German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer sat down to write some of his reflections on the nature of human existence. He pointed out that people are in a perpetual state of self-delusion about their goals. We often think that achieving a goal will fulfill us, but as soon as we achieve one, we're just on to the next one, and there's barely a moment where we enjoy our own accomplishments. As soon as someone buys one Lamborghini, they're already dreaming about buying their second, and every academic accomplishment quickly becomes another bar to jump over when the next test hits. Schopenhauer himself was quite pessimistic about this discovery, as he thought that it meant that humans were just naturally dissatisfied. But Epicurus has a much more optimistic outlook that's definitely worth considering. Epicurus drew a key distinction between what he calls natural needs and groundless needs. We might call these essentials and luxuries. Natural needs are all the things right at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy. They include enough food not to go hungry, enough water not to go thirsty, a roof over your head, and some good friends to keep you company. Epicurus agreed with many other ancient Greek thinkers, such as Aristotle, that it is borderline impossible to be happy unless one's natural needs are adequately met. Even the most blindly content of us would probably change their tune if they ran out of food and were forced out of their homes. To a certain extent, Epicurus thought that we are just innately drawn to fulfilling our natural needs. We have to meet them. There's no getting around it. But groundless needs are very different. Strictly speaking, we don't need to fulfill them to be happy. These are those desires we create for ourselves because of the natural human tendency to strive for more. Once we are done with our natural needs, if we're not careful, our mind will conjure up more things for us to acquire. It might be some fancy house or a new car, but it might also be things like excessive political power or the wish to control those around you. Either way, Epicurus thinks going down this path of groundless needs is the way to misery, and this is for one simple reason: the hedonic treadmill. This is the term used by psychologists today to refer to the human ability to quickly adapt to material circumstances and become unsatisfied, dwelling constantly on what more can be acquired. It is this that causes the CEO to be disappointed with his company's $2 billion profits if there were $2.5 billion profits last year. It is this that leads us to forget gratitude and always hunger for more, even if it's not in our best interests. It's as if we were addicted to a drug and we need stronger and stronger doses of material success to satiate our ever-expanding desires. After all, the world is finite, but the possibilities we can imagine are infinite. So it is entirely possible for us to torture ourselves into thinking that our lives are unsatisfactory, all while our achievements pile up. Some would say that this is a good thing, that it keeps us sharp and forever improving. But Epicurus has a different approach. He thinks that far from helping us, this constant dissatisfaction weighs down our lives. It distracts us and makes us waste our time chasing what will never fulfill us. For Epicurus, attempting to satisfy your groundless needs is like trying to fill up a cup that's leaking. No matter how much water you pour in, 20 minutes later, the cup will be empty, and you'll have to start all over again. And Epicurus knew this thousands of years before the advent of modern psychology. And not to be outdone, Epicurus also has a potential salve for the ultimate human fear. 3. Death. How do we cope with our mortality? This is one of the greatest and oldest philosophical questions. Some have argued that it's the only philosophical question worth asking. It has been the spark that lit the fire of Kierkegaard's genius, and it compelled Camus to write his great work, The Myth of Sisyphus. But while these thinkers were still wrestling with the problem of death in the 19th and 20th centuries, Epicurus had solved the problem, to his satisfaction, in the 4th century BC. In perhaps his most famous quote, he says, "Where I am, death is not. And where death is, I am not." This is a deceptively clever argument, because it sounds very simple, but it has a lot of hidden machinery lurking just beneath the surface. Epicurus was a surprisingly secular thinker. He did not profess a belief in the afterlife, and he thought that when we died, we simply ceased to exist. He was not so much an atheist, but he thought that if the gods did exist, they would be so removed from human affairs as to not care about them at all. So humans were, for all intents and purposes, on their own. This was certainly not the prevailing view in ancient Greece, and it brought with it a host of existential terrors. The most obvious one is the question, what happens when we die? To which Epicurus says, we stop existing. But the natural follow-up question to this is, should we not be completely terrified of death then? Since Epicurus was a philosopher who thought that happiness was the principal human pursuit, he can't really tell his imagined interlocutor to piss off here. So instead, he points out that for something bad to happen to you, you have to exist. But if you stop existing when you die, then there is no you for death to happen to. Nothing bad happens to you when you die, because nothing happens to you at all. There is no you for things to happen to anymore. So according to Epicurus, there is no reason to fear death, because by the time it comes, you will be gone. And I would be genuinely interested to see what you think here. Because when I tell people about this Epicurean view, some people find it immediately helpful. The idea of death not being something that happens to them calms them down, and they move on with a spring in their step. But for others, it seems like the argument is entirely besides the point. The very thing that they fear is not existing anymore. So far from allaying their fear, Epicurus' argument just highlights the very thing they're afraid of. And I think this illuminates a fascinating divergence in our fear of death. I think some people fear death as an event. The idea of the moment coming when their breathing becomes laboured and their heartbeat stops fills them with terror. They are scared of death happening to them, and the moment of dying is the object of their fear. However, for others, and I would count myself amongst this camp, they fear not existing anymore and missing out on the future of the world. They mourn the civilizations they will never get to see, or the books that they'll never get to read. They are not so much scared of death as they are hungry for more life. It's a sort of existential FOMO. My sneaking suspicion is that while Epicurus's argument will appeal very much to the first kind of person, it will not allay the fears of the second kind. But like I said, I would be keen to get your thoughts on this, so please let me know what you think in the comments. And lastly, Epicurus leaves us with some wholesome ideas worth considering. 4. The importance of friends. The world is lonelier than ever. People have far fewer friends than they used to, and men in particular are said to be going through a loneliness epidemic. Many people perceive that a romantic relationship is the solution to these solitary woes, but Epicurus begs to differ. In his view, there is something far more important than romance, and that is good old-fashioned friendship. And here Epicurus is not alone. He has almost the whole of Greek philosophy at his back. Everyone from the Stoics to Plato and Aristotle thought that friendship was self-evidently one of the most important things in someone's life. And we have sadly lost this emphasis on friendship in the modern age. In one of my client meetings, I once had a student who was so unhappy with their time at university that it was beginning to interfere with their studies. I asked what was wrong, and it quickly emerged that he didn't have a single friend. He used to spend all his time with his girlfriend, but they broke up, and he had not taken the time to cultivate a close-knit group of friends. So we immediately got to work rectifying this. We started scheduling in time for him to attend clubs and hobby groups to meet people. We helped his social anxiety by slowly acclimatizing him to interacting with strangers in small ways, and we crafted a strategy to follow up on each potential friend that he met. I tell this story partly to show how unusual it is for somebody to go through all this effort to meet friends. How many of us put even a fraction of this thought into our platonic bonds? We live in a world that blasts the importance of romance into our skulls every hour of the day, but rarely stops to consider the supreme value of sharing a coffee with someone whose company you feel totally relaxed in. If Epicurus had his way, things would be very different. It would not be normal for us to live in these isolated bubbles with just ourselves or our family. We would instead live in large communities where whole groups of friends and families would cohabit together. And imagine how this would change our lives. We would always have someone to turn to if we needed help or support. We would still have privacy, but at any moment we could step outside our door into a community that loved and cherished us. The Epicurean vision is a radical one, but it brings with it the promise of companionship, support, prosperity, and community. Just imagine what that would feel like. We have a clear set of priorities handed down to us from societal pressures. First, there is our career, making money. Next, there is romance, finding a partner. Finally, if there is any time left over, there is community, finding friends. For Epicurus, this order is completely insane. For him, friendship is a natural human need, right up there with water, food, and shelter. It would make no sense to him to deprioritize it. Epicurus would not subordinate the pursuit of friendship to the pursuit of wealth, because he recognized that without friends, money can't make you that happy. Without the baseline level of community needed to nourish our souls, all that extra money might as well be spent on gold paperweights. And Epicurus has been proven right in the minds of some psychiatrists. Despairing about the number of patients he was seeing for anxiety and depression, one British doctor took a radically different approach. He organised a community garden for he and his patients to take care of. In doing this, they formed close bonds with one another. The entire group became stalwart friends, and their reported feelings of loneliness significantly decreased. Along with this, their symptoms of anxiety and depression plummeted. They had been deprived of the human need for companionship and community for too long, and when that need was met, they felt much better. Epicurus would not at all be surprised. So we should replace our popular conception of Epicurus immediately. Instead of picturing him as an amoral hedonist, getting drunk all the time and caring only for himself, we should picture him as a loyal and dependable friend, enjoying a deep conversation in the garden with his nearest and dearest. And if there's one thing we can learn from Epicurus, it's to value our friends. We probably don't realize just how important they are to our happiness and fulfillment. And all of this thinking is developed even further by Aristotle, so check out my video on his philosophy of friendship here. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.